Imagine you're a first century preacher. You've been traveling the Mediterranean telling people the Jewish law can't save them. Now your opponents are throwing your own words back at you. So you're saying we should just sin as much as we want? That's exactly the situation Paul faced when he sat down to write his letter to the Romans. And his response reveals one of the most fascinating and arguably unresolved tensions in the entire New Testament. The accusation from Romans 3:8, let us do evil so that good may come. And that's what Paul's opponents said he was teaching. To understand why Paul was so defensive, we need to understand what he'd already said and why it got him in trouble. The charge against Paul has a name, Antinomianism. Anti means against, nomos means law. Against the law. In his letter to the Galatians, Paul had staked out a radical position. The Jewish law was a temporary disciplinarian, a harsh custodian, whose job ended when Christ arrived. The law was associated with slavery, with the elemental forces of the cosmos. Christ's coming rendered it obsolete for salvation. The logical implication was hard to avoid. If the law no longer matters for your standing before God, what stops you from sinning freely? Paul's opponents saw the opening and drove straight through it. In Romans, Paul confronts the Antinomian charge head-on. Not once, not twice, 3 separate times. First, Romans 3:8. Paul acknowledges the slander directly. People are saying, let us do evil so that good may come. Paul calls this a slanderous charge and says their condemnation is deserved. Second, Romans 6:1. Paul poses the question himself. Should we continue in sin so that grace may abound? His answer is immediate and emphatic. The Greek phrase is me genoito, sometimes translated by no means or God forbid. It's the strongest negation Paul ever uses. Third, Romans 6:15. He asks it again with slightly different framing. Should we sin because we are not under law but under grace? Same emphatic denial, same intensity. Here's what matters. The fact that Paul addresses this charge 3 separate times in a single letter tells us this was a real and persistent problem. His opponents had identified a genuine logical gap in his theology. This was not a straw man. People were drawing this conclusion from Paul's own arguments, and he knew it. Paul's primary defense against the Antinomian charge is baptismal theology. His argument works like this. Through baptism into Christ, believers have died to sin. They've been buried with Christ and raised into a new life. The old self, the self enslaved to sin, has been crucified. Paul's claim is that returning to sin after baptism is not just wrong, it's conceptually impossible. You've exited the realm of sin entirely. You've changed domains, moved from one sphere of power to another. Notice what kind of argument this is. It's experiential and mystical, not strictly logical. Paul doesn't resolve the philosophical problem of why a free person couldn't choose to sin. He appeals instead to a transformation so total that the question itself becomes meaningless. This distinction matters for understanding why the tension in his theology persists. Denying the charge wasn't enough. Paul needed to rethink how he talked about the law. And that's where Romans gets really interesting. Compare what Paul says about the law in Galatians with what he says in Romans, and the shift is dramatic. Same author, same core conviction that the law cannot justify. But the rhetoric, the tone, the framing transformed. This is the heart of the puzzle. In Galatians, the law is a cruel pedagogue, a temporary custodian associated with slavery and the elemental forces of the cosmos. Paul's tone is combative and radical. The law's time is over. In Romans, the law is holy, just, and good. The law and the prophets bear witness to God's righteousness. Paul's faith upholds the law rather than overthrowing it. Look at Romans 3:31. Do we then overthrow the law by this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law. Based on Galatians alone, we might have expected Paul to answer, yes, we overthrow it. He doesn't. This is a deliberate rhetorical pullback. Paul's core conviction hasn't changed. The law still cannot save. But the packaging has shifted dramatically. Different audience, different accusations, different strategy. Paul wrote to the Galatians in the heat of a crisis. He wrote to the Romans carefully, managing his reputation with a church he never visited. One important clarification: Paul did not completely change his mind between these letters. His core conviction that the law cannot justify remains constant in both. What changes is his rhetoric and emphasis, driven by different audiences and different accusations. Romans is not a retraction of Galatians, it's a strategic recalibration. Paul's most creative theological move in Romans is his treatment of sin. To protect the law's dignity while maintaining that the law cannot save, Paul introduces sin as a personified autonomous cosmic force. In Romans 7:11, sin seizes an opportunity in the commandment, deceiving and killing through the law. Sin operates almost like an intelligent being, hijacking a good instrument for destructive purposes. The technical term is hypostatization, treating an abstract concept as if it were a real independent entity. Scholars debate whether Paul means this literally, that sin is an actual cosmic being like the Stoicheia, the elemental forces he mentions elsewhere, or whether this is a rhetorical device, vivid language to make a theological point. The answer changes our understanding of Paul's cosmology significantly. Either way, the move serves a clear purpose. The law isn't the villain, sin is. The law is merely the weapon sin exploits. Then Paul makes a striking claim. Immediately after describing sin using the law as its weapon to deceive and kill, he writes, "So the law is holy and the commandment is holy, just, and good." If sin uses the law as its instrument of death, can the law be fully exonerated? Paul appears to be inserting a protective qualification that doesn't follow logically from his own argument. The tension is deliberate. This theological framework produces one of the most famous passages in Paul's letters, the inner conflict of Romans 7. I do not do what I want. I do the very thing I hate. Two laws war within the human being. The law of God in the inmost self delights in the good and wills righteousness. The law of sin dwelling in the body's members pulls in the opposite direction. The result is moral paralysis, captivity. The human recognizes the good but cannot enact it. One clarification: most scholars read this first-person voice as a rhetorical device representing universal human experience under the law, not Paul's personal autobiography. Paul elsewhere expresses confidence in his own righteousness. So what do we do with all of this? 3 principles for reading Paul more carefully. First, Paul is not a systematic theologian. His letters are occasional documents, texts written for specific communities with specific problems. Galatians and Romans address different audiences and different accusations. His tone and the emphasis shift accordingly. Paul never fully resolved this tension. The law can't save you, but it's holy and good. Sin is the real enemy, but it operates through the law. These paradoxes have fueled 2,000 years of theological debate. And they start right here in a letter written by a man defending himself against the logical consequences of his own radical ideas.